Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. Chairman Barr, the Federal Reserve stress tested 34 banks in 2022. Is that correct?
Senator, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but that
Well, I have your report.
I have your
report. It says 34. And the cutoff was $100 billion. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. You didn't stress test Silicon Valley Bank, did you?
No, under the Federal Reserve Board's rules that were put in place for transition into the stress testing, it takes a while for a firm to be considered above the threshold. Yeah. They need to have a rolling four-quarter average.
Did you stress test Silicon Valley Bank in 2022?
No.
Okay. Silicon Valley Bank had $100 billion, more than $100 billion in assets at the end of 2021, did it not?
Senator, as I was explaining, the transition rules in place at the time require a rolling four-quarter average to be above that amount.
Okay.
And then if the firm happens to be in a year that isn't the year that, since it's an every other year test, that a test is running, then it waits till the next year. So for Silicon Valley Bank, that would have meant 2024 would be its first stress test.
But the point is, you didn't test Silicon Valley Bank.
We did not apply a stress test to Silicon Valley Bank. It was, of course, using its own stress test.
Did you have the authority to do it?
Under our existing regulations, no. We would have to change our regulations to have that authority.
Under the Congress's amendment to Dodd-Frank, Senator Crapo talked about it, 2155. Section 252.3, isn't it a fact that we gave the Federal Reserve the authority to stress test Silicon Valley Bank?
Under that legislation, the Federal Reserve could have put in place a rule defining the word periodic,
but you didn't.
In a different way than was done.
Right, but you didn't, did you?
The Federal Reserve did not do that.
Okay. If you had stress tests, let me put it this way. If you had stress tested Silicon Valley Bank in 2022, it wouldn't have made any difference, would it?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, you didn't test for Silicon Valley Bank's problem. I've read your report. You stress tested these 34 banks for falling GDP, spike in unemployment, and defaults in commercial real estate. Isn't that correct?
Yes, in a typical adverse scenario for banks, we're testing falling interest rate environments.
But that wasn't our problem in 2022.
I completely agree with you.
It's not our problem today. The problem is inflation, high interest rate, and loss of value in government bonds, isn't it?
I completely agree with you.
So you stress tested in 2022 for the wrong thing.
The stress test is not the primary way that the Federal Reserve or other regulators test for interest rate risk.
But you stress tested for the wrong thing.
As I said, Senator, I agree with you that it would be useful to test for higher rising interest rates. That's why in our alternative scenario, multiple scenario that we put in place for this year's stress test, we do that. These decisions were made before I arrived, but I agree with you that it would be better to do that.
But it's like somebody going in for a test for COVID and getting a test for cholera, isn't it?
I don't know enough about either of those tests to know.
Yeah. Well, they're different. So all this business about, the amendment to Dodd-Frank kept them from stress testing. The way I see it, you chose not to stress test, and if you had stress test Silicon Valley Bank, you wouldn't have caught the problem.
As I said, Senator, I agree with you that the statute requires periodic stress testing. The Federal Reserve made a decision about how to implement that in 2019.
Right.
That resulted in SVB not being planned to be tested until 2024. But as I said, the stress test requirements...
You knew from the... I'm sorry to cut you off, but the chairman's going to cut me off in a second. But you knew... The Federal Reserve knew well in advance that Silicon Valley Bank had a problem withholding too much of its money in interest rate sensitive long government bonds, didn't you?
I think the investing public and the Federal Reserve, which cited it for interest rate risk problems, knew that it had interest rate risk. I think
The Federal
nobody
Reserve didn't
anticipated
do anything
a bank.
about it, did it?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear
The
you.
Federal Reserve didn't do anything about it, did it?
I disagree with that, Senator, respectfully. The Federal Reserve did cite these problems to the bank and require them to take action. Bank management failed to act on those.
You didn't follow up,
citations.
did you?
Senator's time has expired. I think that I sit here and watch Mr. Barr reluctant to criticize some of the moves of his predecessors at the Federal Reserve. I'll leave it at that. Senator Smith from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks